Plis gyma, ham ei tolis y gyrffeithing yn Sean Och, some acute and cautionary. And I'm going to switch to a much inferior language because I know it's one that everybody's going to understand. I'm Margaret McKechnie from Finlaggan Trust, and as many of you know, this is David Caldwell. David's been involved with the Trust pretty much since it started, and he's had a long and distinguished career in the museum sector. I say that to try and embarrass him. Now, as well as that, David has published several books, and I know with Christmas coming up, you will all be delighted to hear we have some copies of his books here available. So that's that taken away. But before we have that seemingly stampede to the front, to get your hand in one of these books. Even better news is he has just written another book, which is part of the reason for his talk tonight. Not available to buy just yet. It'll be coming out next year, so it'll be ready in time for next Christmas as well. I am telling you, Harrington, it's not a word of I am telling you here at Finlaggan, we have nothing but your happiness. There we go. So I'm going to ask David to give you a wee kind of sample of what his new book is going to cover, a bit of background of that, and tell you a wee bit about the dig at Finlaggan that he was in charge of in the early 90s, and that has produced quite a number of artefacts. And I'm sure that all of you have been up to Finlaggan to see them. To see looking round the room for anyone who goes. So without further nonsense, I will hand you over to David Caldwell. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Good to see so many of you. I did the excavations at Finlaggan in the 1990s, and at that time and ever since, I've enjoyed and really appreciated the support and friendship of you people in Islay. It's been very much appreciated. Now, many of you probably think of archaeology as being about people on their knees with a wee trowel and digging away. And yes, it is about that. And also quite heavy manual labour as well, I might add. But that's only a small part of it. You know, we did the excavations from 1990 to 1997, and it's taken me all the time since then to process all the information and get it together. All right, I've done one or two other things as well, and I have a family. Okay, you can take that for granted. The book about the excavations, which is not wee, by the way, it's 260,000 words and got 600 illustrations, I think. It should be published next year by the Society of Antiquities of Scotland. And I felt that I owed it to you people in Islay who've been so kind to now try and give you just some idea of what we think we've found out about Finlaggan, and perhaps hopefully whet your appetite for things going on. It's not the final word. Nothing in research is ever the final word, but this is what I genuinely believe we've found out and what I think will be of interest. And it's just a small part of the information that I think we've got about this absolutely one place that you guys have lots of opportunities to go and so please do, and the visitor centre, as Myron said. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yep, good. Right. So when I worked for the National Museum in Edinburgh, and they supported excavation as a research project. And when we said that we wanted to do this, what we were firmly focused on was the medieval period, and the idea that in the medieval period, Finlaggan was a centre of considerable importance, the centre of the Lordship of the Isles, the MacDonalds, and what influenced the whole way we approached the work. We're firmly focused on that. Our understanding that this was a very large and important lordship there, the successor to a separate kingdom that existed up to 1266, and with MacDonald's with to be kings in a Gallic, a Celtic world, and also very considerable patrons of the arts, with immense influence well beyond the lordship in Ireland and up the Great Glen and the enormous earldom of Ross, and a very particular lifestyle. It was very much a militarized society that produced this image of a warrior at Kildalton, and which produced warriors in the same way that perhaps other societies produced farm animals and so on. That was our understanding of what we focused on, and that influenced the whole way that we approached the excavation. And it still, by the way, remains an important aspect of what we're looking at. Next slide, please. Our understanding of what Finlaggan was before we started the dig was that it consisted of two islands in this inland loch, Islay Nature, the large island, and Islay Nature, the council island. And as the project developed and we attempted more and more to put it in context, we realized that that was a very tight definition and a wider look, not just the historical documentation, of which there's not all that much, but also, sort of look earlier, look later, and look very much in the surrounding countryside to get a much better understanding of what was happening. And I've marked in there some other parts which I think were quite important to the way we looked at the site. There's the mound next to the visitor centre, Crescenda, which we realised was of quite significance the way the site had developed. It's a natural mound, by the way, okay, just a big lump of rock covered with grass. There's a standing stone nearby. In the background, you've got the Paps of Jura, and just that tremendous green landscape with fertile land roundabout. And the name Finlaggan caused us some concern because in many ways the name just dates from the 19th century. The farm there was known as Portnellan beforehand. But there was an understanding that the name Finlaggan might relate to a saint who was around in earlier times. But we couldn't find any record of a name for this place prior to the 15th century, when the main island was known as the island of St. Finlaggan. So the locals understood that that's where the name came from. Next slide, please. So St. Finlaggan, or St. Finluggan, who was he? Why did we have this name? Well, he appears in the early biography of St. Clair, written by Adamnan about 700. And he was an Irish monk who rescued the saint from a would-be assassin on the island of Hinba, possibly Jura, okay? Not 100% sure. And St. Finlaggan comes from. And when we did our excavations, we were aware that there might be early evidence for this being a monastic site or a place where a saint had lived and worked. And we did find on the Islay Nature in the burial ground evidence that graves went back quite early. And we did find the remains of one grave, and this shows two phases of it. It's what you would call a burial. And it had underneath the capstones, you can see the bones there, the remains of the body of a young woman about 25 in age. And we got a radiocarbon date on her, which suggested that the burial did date to the 7th century. Not as early as St. Finlaggan himself, but it did at least indicate that there perhaps was some earlier Christian presence on the island. And that maybe the idea of St. Finlaggan goes back to that time. However, more mature deliberation on my part in thinking and assessing other evidence, I'm not now thinking that as an idea. We've got one early grave here, and that's not really a good evidence, a good range of evidence in which to build the whole concept of an early church site. We've certainly got a lot of evidence from our excavations, which we saw in small parts here and there, of very considerable earlier activity, going back to early historic times and back into history. Even the association with St. Finlaggan, is, I think, one which is quite troubling. As I say, the earliest evidence for that association is 15th century documents. And what I may well be key is that where one does have other evidence for dedications to this saint, apart from an Islay, is in Derry, in the north of Ireland, and more particularly the lordship from which came a certain lady, Amy O'Kane, who married Angus Og, the Lord, about 1300. Angus Og, the leader of the MacDonalds who fought with Bruce at Bannockburn. And the traditions are that when she married Angus Og, she brought from Ireland ancestors of various important families, not least the Beatons of the Macbeths, the family of hereditary physicians that took over so much of medical advancement in Scotland in the medieval period. And I do wonder if, in fact, the dedication to St. Finlaggan came with her in the late 13th century, just an idea. One curiosity which is of interest is I put up an image of a piece of ivory which appears to be the arm of a crucifix, perhaps if you like. And we actually found that arguably in the debris which had come from the altar in the chapel, the medieval chapel on Islay Moor. And it may be a part of a relic which would have been believed to have been associated with St. Finlaggan. Quite an interesting discovery. Next slide, please. So anyway, as I say, we expanded our interest to try and put the site in context, and we ended up doing an archaeological survey of a whole area round about Loch Finlaggan. There's a loch there, there's 2 islands, and all those red spots mark, I think it's about 70 odd sites of interest dating from prehistoric times up until recent times. And we were fortunate to enlist the cooperation of the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments. A lot of mapping for us at the level of actually mapping in the individual agricultural rigs, which helped give us an understanding of a very interesting landscape where there's quite a palimpsest of remains of agricultural and other activity going back to early times. And that's the area at Robles, where there's another canner, Galen Gura. And it's possible to interpret these rigs as being the successive remains of several agricultural systems. I think in there's some medieval or earlier field systems with later expansion, and also a fair amount of mining activity, because one of the key things about this part of Islay is the evidence for lead mining, the mining of galena, probably back to the 13th century, if not much earlier. And the knowledge that there's quite a lot of silver extracted from that as well. And one of the things which I think we can see here is a whole slice here, which was a mining session, which was cut through fields, and where there was successful lead mining in the 18th and 19th century. So it's an attempt to try and understand things like that we've included in the publication. Next slide, please. I mentioned lead mining, the fact that there is galena, lead ore, in this landscape, but there's other characteristics which are quite important in terms of understanding what was happening. And I hope you can sort of see from this picture that there's a sort of, well, I put in that yellow line marking what's called the Bunnahabhain Fault. That's the way the geologists have been spelling it, by the way I know it's not spelled like that in modern maps. And what one's seeing here is a very considerable unconformity, if you like, in the landscape. There's good quality agricultural land in this part of Islay on limestone, and you can see the greenness of it on this right-hand side of the image, and on the other side where the it's been developed, it's different land altogether. It's potassic tillite, there's quartzite. A very poor base for developing soils that any use for agricultural activity. So you've got a landscape where there's very clear division, and it would have been obvious to people. I mean, humans are not daft; they could see things like that for themselves in the landscape. And along the fault, there would have been a considerable amount of mineralization. That's where a lot of the galena is coming from. A place of interest to animals, where there'd be licks for deer and so on. Now, what's key about this, I think, is that ancestral or important early hunting grounds in Ireland are often places where there are similar unconformities in the landscape. And there are also places where assemblies, meeting places, places for important events were developed in the past. This sort of thing has been documented by a major research project at University College Galway. And to that extent, Finlaggan conforms to that type of picture. And one of the, incidentally, in the process of the excavation, we logged over 4,000 finds individually. And most of them, you know, very, very small and insignificant, if you like. But one of the main finds was a lot of flint tools, flint flakes, a lot of them dating to Mesolithic times. There's a couple there with a Neolithic arrowhead. None of these we deemed were where they'd been dropped or lost by the people who created them. They had been churned up or reused in various ways in later deposits. But clearly this was an area where there's a great deal of hunting activity right from early times. And we know this, that there's references in the medieval period to this sort of activity. And we found a very interesting series of metal finds in midden deposits from the medieval period, which I think can be identified as dog, means a dog collar. You know, that's where the you know, the two bits of the collar came together. It would have been decorated with studs, and that's the swivel ring where you attached your leash. And on the basis of the ornamentation on that and other ones, you're looking at 13th century workmanship. And it's an illustration of that this is a place where hunting was of importance, probably for a very long period of time. And that may have been one of the reasons why it was so important. And hunting, of course, in the medieval period was extremely, it's only posh people, big guys, you know, who did it. It was a very expensive activity. Next slide, please. And not only, and by the way, I might say too, I did toy with the idea, I have toyed with the idea and rejected it, that maybe there wasn't a Saint Finlaggan. You know, maybe it's just a load of nonsense. But actually, what it is a Christianization of the name Finn, as in Finn McCool, the famous early Irish Scottish warrior, and his followers who are commemorated in various places. And who were looked back to as really significant and important. It's just possible that's the case, but maybe that's a guess too far. But it was something that flashed through my mind that maybe that's what Finlaggan was really about. It was commemorating Finn McCool and his followers. But so important as a hunting place, an assembly place, going back into prehistoric times. And again, there's been quite a lot of recent scholarly interest in assembly places where there were legal meetings, where there was the creation of kings and other things happening. And often what one finds at these sites is a mound. Think, in fact, of somewhere like Scone, where the kings of the Scots were crowned, where there's a big assembly mound. And you find this in lots of other places. And here, in a way, slightly ignored at Finlaggan, you have this mound next to the visitor centre at Crossenda. And the name Crossenda means approximately the old mound. When the census people came to this part of Islay in the 1851 census, I think it was, these guys were not local, and they ostentatiously avoided using any Gaelic names. And the name they gave this place was Toom. And that must have been because they thought that, or had been told by the natives, the locals, that it was a tomb. But it's a solid lump of rock. It's just a natural mound, and it's an incredible place that you can see from all sorts of distances. But its presence there and later traditions and knowledge about the role Finlaggan had as a place where Lords of the Isles did, and where there were meetings of the Council of the Isles. I think it makes you think, well, what is it we've got here? And of course, elsewhere in the general area of the lordship or its predecessor kingdom of the Isles, the folks in Man will draw attention to a mound that's now sculpted into various layers, which some of them are, at Tynwald in the Isle of Man, for which is now seen as the origin of the parliaments on the Isle of Man, which were thought to relate to the whole area of the Hebrides as well. Is this another of these mounds, these sites that we've got at Finlaggan? And often these mounds, there's evidence of other prehistoric ritual activity. Archaeologists, when they don't know what the hell they're dealing with, the easy way out is say, oh, it's ritual significance. So you put up a stone and ritual significance, so there we go. And that stone is within easy reach of the mound at Crescenda, and there's knowledge of other stones having stood at an earlier date. But although it's a solid lump of rock, yeah, go on, next one. Yeah, we did discover that there was archaeology about it. In 1994, we managed to get the Time team to come and excavate here, and first time they'd ventured out of England. And for a variety of reasons, we thought, well, we'll get them to do some excavations on top of the mound. And what that showed was that the top of the mound had centrally placed on it a cairn, a burial cairn of Bronze Age date by curbstones. There's just a plan of it there with the curbstones. Frankly, if you don't mind me saying so, when that was there, it would have given the impression that you had basically a big breast with a nipple on top of it. Okay, and that's not dissimilar to some other mounds or old tombs, prehistoric tombs in Ireland, which you also know were important inauguration sites for kings or assembly sites. And beyond that, quite remarkably, on the top of the mound, we found this, what I called a chamber, a stone-lined chamber. There's a plan of it there, and there it is there, fully excavated. And from it had been dug out in the past, but we found that rather beautiful flint arrowhead, which is a Bronze Age date. And what I think is a whirligig, a bone toy. You put strings on it, you whiz it around, and it makes a whizzing noise. And conventional wisdom would be that it dates to the Iron Age. But you've got this chamber. It clearly wasn't a souterrain, if you know what those are. It wasn't a grave or anything. It was some sort of underground chamber in the top of the mound. And that's ritual significance. But I think I'm dealing with something really quite interesting here. And, one can seek parallels. For instance, there's a Mine How up in Orkney, where there's a sort of very much larger, deeper chamber on a site also of ritual significance, where you can go down steps into the ground. But I think this is marking this mound out as being beyond the ordinary in some sort of way, and of significance in terms of the traditions that we later have for Finlaggan. A real assembly mound, perhaps going a place of importance going back to prehistoric times. No evidence for lintels in this. I mean, it may have had a wooden lid of some sort, by the way, on it. That's our best guess for it. The next slide, please. But if that wasn't interesting enough in terms of providing a prehistoric context, perhaps, for ritual activity in the medieval period, it was we spotted other things which suggested very strong parallels elsewhere. Now, when we excavated the smaller island, Islay Nature Centre, the council island, what we discovered was that the bulk of the island, and it's suggested by the aerial photograph, was the remains of a stone-walled fort, presumably of Iron Age date. And you can just see in the top image there that the curving stonework there just to the right of the ranging rod, which is the interior wall of a stone-walled fort, perhaps with quite high walls. And adjacent to it, and this is small scale excavation where we're actually looking for elsewhere. That's excavating the bottom of the loch, thanks to the army having drained some of the water out for us. And you can take my word for it that what you've seen there is evidence for a crannog structure, an artificial island made up of, peat and brushwood and timbers and so on. And we got radiocarbon dates which suggested, a range from about the time of Christ up to about the 7th century. So quite an important residence in the Iron Age, early historic period, and the evidence of the grave and a larger island and various other structures which we saw just in small bits or had been truncated by later activity. So quite a sense that there were quite important things happening. And evidence under the water for a causeway connecting the two, which may have been that early. Difficult to date the causeway. But certainly some quite interesting things happening there. On the next one, please. And it was quite easy to compare that as an island dwelling with various other island forts, and like that one up in North Uist, where it's just a little island with a tower or a fort on it, and in some cases evidence of crannogs next to them. But in some ways, a more telling comparison, I think, is a site up in Shetland at Tingwall. Now, you folks know that there's quite a considerable Viking Scandinavian heritage in this part of the world. And one of the key things about the Scandinavian world is these assembly sites, often called ting sites, where there were meetings of the great and the good to sort out business, and kings were crowned in some of the main sites and so on. And there's quite a remarkable comparison between Tingwall, which was the main site for the whole of the Shetland Islands, and Finlaggan. It'd be quite easy, in fact, to confuse the two. On the next slide, please. There's just two shots, as it were, with you're looking at Finlaggan and the black and white photograph there, and the two islands, fertile land, some of the best fertile land on Islay, and the same sort of situation on an inland loch in Tingwall, where you've got the actual Ting site there, which was a separate island, and you can see there the traces of the causeway to the land nearby, and there's a church site there, the church in the main island at Finlaggan as well. And other quite key things, the other end of the loch at Tingwall, there is a standing stone, which looks like it's marking the whole area around the loch as being a sanctuary site, a place where you were safe from other people, whole area where people could come for major meetings. And there was, it's still there actually, there is in the land of Keppels at the south of Loch Finlaggan, standing stone, which is now fallen. One wonders if it's the same sort of situation. So even if you ignored the mound at Crossend and saw it something different or earlier, the similarity of the setup at Finlaggan, the politics, the actual of the people and so on, would mark it out as being potentially quite an important ting site meeting place, it seems to me, with the actual meeting on what we now call the council island itself. And that, I think, is very likely. Could I have the next slide, please? What is curiously interesting about this is that plumped on top of that small island, sometime in the 12th century, was an enormous stone tower. Being quite like that stone tower, late 12th century tower at Caldwell. In fact, and rather like the towers built, for instance, by King David Carlisle, and also people don't really appreciate this, the one the Scots built at Lancaster, which is by and large still standing. Major structure, and also quite a statement you know, if you got a sort of a meeting place for a kingdom, if you like, and somebody comes along and sort of says, right, we'll just flatten that and build a bloody big tower on it. You know, what is the message? What is happening here? And I think that is one of the most intriguing things about Finlaggan. We had no idea that that's going to be there, but it just took us totally by surprise. The entire similar one in the general area of the Kingdom of the Isles is one at Rushen in an island man, not much of which survives, but remarkably similar in stonework, incidentally. So it could have been the same masons. So who was responsible for this tower? There's an artistic image of the one at Finlaggan. Who was responsible for this tower at Finlaggan? Next slide, please. And by the way, this is the sort of archaeological evidence we're dealing with. We didn't expose the whole thing, okay? But there's a trench through one of the walls, and the main wall is behind that horizontal ranging rod there. Massive masonry wall with dressed stone. The wall would have been, it's about 1.5 meters thick, and at an early date, the wall was widened a bit in the foreground, which may have been quite substantial plinth. So the actual total width of the walls of this tower is about, I'm talking about 20 meters square, okay? 20 meters square tower with walls about 2 meters thick. That's what was there. Now, what you can see from that picture there is it was totally flattened. It was totally eradicated, flattened, perhaps about 1300 or thereabouts. And not only was it flattened, after it's flattened, they even started digging trenches to rob out some of the remaining walls. It was a really thorough job to get rid of this. But nevertheless, it was standing there, presumably, for over 100 years. It was not a castle in the sense of a place for a garrison. It was for a distinguished regal, one assumes. And thanks to the army, here's the coffer dam they built for us so we could excavate the bottom of the loch and pull out goodies, amazing waterlogged material, leather, but also lots of bones, indication of quality living. Very high percentage of pork, incidentally, which in the northern world is a sign of class, of being sophisticated. There's some red deer, of course, from the hunting, cattle, sheep. But we were also getting things like walnuts and almonds and cherry stones, which I don't think we grew here at any time. And telltale little bits of pottery, good quality pottery from the southwest of France. Claret, okay? So you can imagine these people sitting on their deck chairs by the side of the loch with the big glasses of claret and eating all these cherries and walnuts. That's the sort of society you're dealing with. But who were they? And that is one of the challenges. Who built it? And the best guess on my part is that I think that it could well be a tower that was built by one Ranald, the son of Somerled, who is referred to in contemporary documents as a king, okay? And ancestor of MacDonalds and various other families, who obviously cut quite a considerable figure in the Western world at that time and may have been a crusader. And that is my best guess as to who would have built this. But it may also represent the fact that it was built over the top of what I think was an earlier Ting site, meeting place, is quite a major statement of something. So there you go. Next one, please. So because of our approach to excavation and the fact we didn't want to remove a lot of later material, we're only able to look at a lot of the stuff on the two islands in little bits and pieces. There's a bit of that pottery from the southwest of France, but there's just where the tower would have been connected by a causeway, and we picked up enough evidence to suggest that the main island was surrounded by timberwork fortifications. There was a hall, there was probably a chapel. The top part of the island was probably a paddock. I mean, when you find horseshoe nails in a horseshoe, these don't tend to fall out of people's pockets. It's probably a better indication than that. And the trouble is that we're looking at, those stone walls in that picture there are later medieval structures, and we're just able to expose little bits and pieces of earlier structures. Like that probably contained a wooden trough associated with industrial process. But enough to indicate that we had had quite a major residence. And in a way, it was configured with a tower and its associated courtyards in the main island, rather than in the line of mainstream European castles. And well, we know that Ranald counted himself as a king and had his own seal and so on, and probably issued documents and so on. And the grave slab there, incidentally, um, worn, but I think that's really quite interesting because I would think that that probably does date to the 12th century, and that would probably indicate that there was a church there at that period. And it's very Scandinavian in style, by the way. If you want to make a close parallel between the decoration and that, I know it's very worn, you would look at something like the Lewis chessmen, which come from Lewis, funnily enough, but are Scandinavian and of that date. The next one, please. Anyway, it looks like the castle destroyed, flattened, all this about 1300, and you can come up with various scenarios for why that happened. And what one finds in the 14th and 15th century is that this site, the island, could be what it could reasonably be called a palace for the MacDonald lords of the Isles, the descendants of Ranald and other major lineages who came to the fore in the 14th, 15th century as a result of Robert Bruce and various other less pleasant activities. And what that slide incidentally is showing, I should say, is that is the one of the castle walls. It's just totally flattened, and these later structures just built right over the top of it. That's the cement floor. Basically, it's a cement of the castle. But yeah, next slide, please. So in the 14th, 15th century, and this is what we expected to find, what we thought a lot of the upstanding humps and the bumps on the islands would turn out to be, 14th, 15th century, what might be called a palace. And by palace, it just means a substantial residence with a lot of separate buildings, for a great lord. And yeah, that's what we found. And I'm not, in the course of this talk, there's some wonderful gingerbread out there, and I'm anxious to get to it before you lot do. I'm not going to go into all the boring detail of all the things we discovered, but we did find evidence of quite substantial build-up on this island of and quite an orderly arrangement of houses on plots connected by roads. There's examples there. I mean, this road system on the island, I think, probably dates to the late 14th or 15th century. And, there was no idea these people would get muddy walking around on these. And a lot of the houses may have been of turf and wood, but that's no reason to think that they were not, good quality residences. And we're probably dealing with a site which was not occupied all year round. It was just a place where the lords of the Isles and their entourage of hundreds, literally, came for perhaps during the summer months for main meetings, and otherwise the island would have been reasonably empty. But there was a burial ground, there was a church, and that's fairly unusual, a church and burial ground, but the church was probably of importance because the lords would have had in their entourage churchmen who acted as their civil servants, basically, okay? And the island was approached from the edge of the loch by causeway. There's still a causeway connecting with the smaller island as well. And the main building on the island was a great hall, which is where feasting took place. It was not fortified. It was not a castle. These guys, in a way, they were demonstrating their importance and sophistication by not having to live in a castle like lesser people did. They just had a place where they could entertain people in style. And I think that's what one's seen here. The next one, please. And this is the Great Hall, a plan of it, quite a large structure. That's it up there. You can see it in the aerial photograph, okay? Foundations of it still pretty obvious. And as it was remodeled, it was originally dated to the time of the castle, but as remodeled, it had a separate chamber, for at one end, presumably with a room up above, because we've got the chute from a latrine up there, and big fireplace at this end, the whole width of the hall, and quite sophisticated masonry. They were importing sandstone from Arran or Kintyre for dressings, window dressings, door dressings, and so on. And it was roofed with slate. A lot of the buildings at this period were roofed with slates. And we don't know where the slate's coming from, by the way. It's not local. I mean, they did use some of the local phyllites and Estill type slate, but this type of slate, and with quite a sophisticated system, roofing system. We're not quite sure where it came from. And although we didn't find that in situ, that carving of a rather miserable looking person, I think is probably the stop, if you like, from the hood over quite a large doorway, perhaps originally the doorway into the hall. So fairly sophisticated architecture was involved. Next one, please. And on the small island, we found what we think was a council chamber. It's referred to in a 16th century document that was a council chamber, which was where the council of the Isles met. And this is a place to go into, but it was a parliament. Okay, that's what it was. It was a parliament where business was done, and it's measures of the sophistication of local society and the pretensions, if you like, of the MacDonalds to be seen as kings. What you're seeing there is just part of an entrance, part of the walling of the chamber. It's that part, well, way up at the top of the slide, that's the plan there. Fairly large-sized chamber, if you like. And by the way, a point I would make is that that's basically how it looked when we took the turf off. Like that, you know, a sort of courtyard with a lot of rough, rubbly stuff in the background. And these walls reduced to a level and just earth inside. Buildings don't fall down like that. You know, when places get abandoned or they get wrecked or whatever, that's not what happens. What we're seeing here and elsewhere, and it took me a long time for this to twig, is that we got there with quite considerable efforts at manicuring the site. Don't know when that was done, but one of the things was that I excavated that in what would have been the center of this building, found a bottle with a message in it and a stick coming out the top. Now, unfortunately, the writing had gone. We couldn't get anything out of it. But there were some things happening. I just mentioned this now, and other evidence of it elsewhere on the site, because if there's any memory or traditions any of you folks got from your grandparents or anything, but things happening at the site, now realize how important or interesting that would be. You can tell my colleagues from the Finlaggan Trust about it. They're quite anxious to know. Okay. But anyway, a council hall. Next slide, please. And what the whole site looks like by the 15th century is quite a sort of ritual sort of look about it. You know, you approach the main island by a jetty. There's the hall and all the feasting, which would be the obvious structure you see when you're coming to the site from afar, sticking up with this amazing roof. And when you got toes and, you know, drinking too much and you had to be dragged out, you know, that was a sign of being a good host. Various other buildings of various sorts, including a stable and a chapel where things happened, and this road system. And there's a sense of perhaps ritual layout about this, that perhaps when there were council meetings or other things happening, that lords were being made, there was processing along these roads across the causeway. And this activity could be seen from the edge of the loch by all the hundreds or thousands of people who attended these occasions for the games and the trading and all the rest of the things that happen. And of course, one of the other traditions about Finlaggan was that comes to us from a 17th century history. This is where Lords of the Isles were made, and they were stood on a stone with a footprint in it. And they were handed over the symbols of their authority, and a point turned up and read out their genealogy, and there was a massive piss up and all the usual things that happens in these events. And a number of years ago, this medieval, it must be 15th century, rather worn grave slab, something quite high status, was pulled out the loch, which slipped in from the erosion round about the chapel. And it's pointed out that there was this, if you like, foot-shaped print in the back of it, and it was immediately identified by locals as being the footprint where the Lords of the Isles were inaugurated. And my cynical viewpoint was instantly, yeah, that will be right. You must be kidding. What a load of nonsense. But don't offend local susceptibilities about this and say, oh, yeah, that's very interesting. But you know what? I think it probably is. I really do. I think what it is, that this could well be the stone that's been referred to in the 17th century history, where a Lord of the Isles was required to put his foot. And again, the folks at Liz Fitzpatrick at Galway has done a survey of footprints in these islands, which are often associated with such events. And there's about 30 of them in Ireland and Scotland mostly. And when you look at them, most of the footprints are not really all that convincing. And where there's dating evidence for them, they're sort of medieval or post-medieval in date, which is what this presumably is. So maybe it is right enough. The one that people say, yeah, but what about the footprints at the fort at Dunad, which you probably over. But how do you know what date they are? Just because there's what's said to be a Pictish carving next to it. How do you know that dates it to Pictish times? We don't. And I don't think there's any supporting evidence to show that this tradition is that early. So you tell me I'm wrong, because I'm quite interested in this, that it may be something that's later than people think. So. What there also is at Finlaggan, look at that handsome young chap there. Doesn't he deserve a piece of gingerbread with the race? So hurry up, David. Get on with this. Thomas Pennant, the Welsh travel writer, who was here in 1774, was shown a stone incorporated in a little jetty next to the site, which he said had A2 on it for Aeneas II, Angus Og. Okay? And it was lost to sight for ages until accidentally somebody in the dig rediscovered it. And there it is, with no idea the size and shape of the stone, but it's got these sort of slice marks on it, and there's an interpretation of them at the top. And you can see why somebody thought it was A2. All right, 2A, go on then. But that's clearly what Pennant was referring to. And we also discovered, more or less the same time, another block of stone nearby on the edge of the loch, which very clearly has on it in a medieval script, A2. So that's Angus Og. The other one must be Angus More. And what the hell's that about? Now, you could claim, as I have done in the past, that actually, or maybe when they had their inauguration ceremonies, they used a different stone and they marked, oh, this is the one we used for Angus and this is the one we used for his dad. And that's not so daft, by the way, because there is a site at Mora in Sweden where kings were elected in the medieval period. And it does look like there was a tradition using and marking different stones. So, you know, it's not such a silly idea. But on the other hand, I've since thinking that, realised that these slice marks on the stone are maybe something a bit different. And they are slice marks. I mean, somebody's taken a sharp blade and sliced that stone. And you find these slice marks and other important stones in Ireland and elsewhere associated with ritual. I'll tell you where else there are slice marks like that, which I've interpreted, by the way. So there, on the stone is good. Okay. And it seems to be an activity particularly associated with the making of kings in some cases. And you got them at Finlaggan. So you've got these two stones. Come on, next slide, please. This is the other one nearby, incidentally. And you can see, I've done a detail there with A and the one on it there. So two stones on the edge of the loch. And I now think that maybe these are referred to, because in the 17th century history I referred to, which we think was written in Skye in the middle of the 17th century, there's a reference to Argyll, and the context means the Marquis of Argyll in the middle of the 17th century, coming to Finlaggan and removing the stone on which the MacDonald sat and the stone table used in council meetings. Okay, I think this is them. His men thought, you think we're taking it any further than the edge of the loch, got another thing coming. And I think there's just been dumped there. And again, this idea of having these stones, you see elsewhere, I mentioned more in Sweden, but Tingwall, which I showed you earlier on Shetland, there's a tradition known right up to the 18th century where there were stone seats for the main players at meetings. And there are other cases of that in the Scandinavian world. So I think these stones are of quite considerable importance. And maybe there should be a case for digging the other one out of the loch, by the way, and seeing what size and shape the thing is and making sure it doesn't get lost to sight again. So next one, please. So starting from the beginning, going back to prehistoric times, there's this sense that there was some magic, if you like, about the place. It was a place where there was people met and where important things happened, like the creation of kings and lords. Finlaggan, the medieval Finlaggan, came to an end about 1500. It looks like it was getting the right going over on behalf of James IV. There's archaeological reasons for thinking that. It backs up a contemporary account of how the leaders of Clan Donald were captured at Finlaggan and taken back to Edinburgh for a right good hanging. Okay. But a lot of what you see in the island now, and there's just an interpretation of it on the main island, is buildings and structures which actually relate to activity in the 16th century. And we hadn't initially appreciated that that was the case. Now, in some cases, remains of medieval buildings were reused. Not a great deal, but in some cases there were. And the good example of that is what we've christened McGillespie's house. It relates to the guy who was crown tenant here in the 1540s, and maybe it was his. But the purple, if you like, and it represents the remains of a medieval building that I think dates to about 1300, but it's been rebuilt into a little two-story house of some reasonable sophistication. And what one has actually, with no evidence, incidentally, at this period, the 16th century onwards, of occupation of the island, abandoned. But at the bottom end of the main island, we possibly have quite a high status residence, at least in some of the 16th century. Next slide, please. And one of the main buildings there, Building P, which is this rectangular hall, which you only made very limited inroads into, I think was very probably quite a sophisticated two-story house. And perhaps an obvious parallel for it is what is called the Buttery in Dunluce Castle, the other side of the North Channel. And whoever built this house or had it in the 16th century, it would have been Donald Lords, even though they didn't necessarily have good paper right to it, as it were. But one imagines James MacDonald of the Newvig and the Glens, the chief of Clan Donald South, if you like. This building here would have been built by his son or grandson, the Earl of Antrim. And I think that there's some interesting parallels. This building at Dunluce Castle was said to be a hall that was specifically built in the 16th century for the entertainment of distinguished visitors. Centre at Finlaggan, which we're not aware of because the MacDonalds had been forfeited and because they didn't have good legal right to it, we don't have any paper records. And this is one of the dangers with history. If you don't have paper records, you don't believe that things are there. Case is the castle that I talked about, the big stone tower on Aileen na Corley. It's not referred to in any document, and we don't know what its name was. I don't believe for one moment it was called, the castle next to the island of St. Finlaggan. No, that's just nonsense. And I mean, what's happened here is that there's been a whole lot of names, place names, presumably of Scandinavian origin, that have been lost and replaced more recently. And we just don't know what the name of the place was. Quite remarkable for such a large, important structure. So sophisticated high status residence in the 16th century, excellent for some of the time. And also, quite intriguing, evidence for quite sophisticated fortification at the other end of the island. You can maybe just see here the remains of turf banks, which are the remains of timberwork fortification. We excavated some of it, and you can see where the timbers had stood and so on sometime in the 16th century. And what I think we're dealing with there is quite sophisticated fortification, not unlike this one belonging to the Adeels in Ireland. That's planned in 1602, but without the waterworks in between. And some of the details of this, like the rectangular wooden tower there, or these circular bastions with a big circular timber tower, we get excavated evidence of that at Finlaggan. Next one, please. And it's sort of slight material when you see it in plan, but we've got evidence. For instance, this is where the entranceway into the main island. There was a circular structure here which consisted of a turf platform with evidence for post holes for massive upright timbers. And what I'm plotting on there is the distribution of nails and rivets, which I think were for holding the structure together. It would have been, sort of weatherboarding held together in a sort of clinker-like fashion. And up near the chapel on the highest part of the island, we got 4 massive post holes, stone settings, perhaps the base of a step here, and again a distribution of nails and rivets, which I think was for another rectangular wooden tower. And we can see these being plotted on 16th century Irish sites in Ulster. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact date of this or who would have built it. I think earlier than the MacDonald Uprising in the early 17th century, maybe more middle of the century, I'm guessing. But there's other evidence for military activity I just throw in. We've got evidence for 3 what you would call cannonballs, incidentally. 2 of stone, not very large size, and a third one, well, that's just very much broken. And that third one, what it is actually is a stone. I don't think it's geologically anything to do with either. What it is a stone that's been encased in lead to create a nice, heavier round ball. And the balls show sign of having been smashed, hit other objects. Now, frankly, the most likely explanation for these balls, I think, for a variety of reasons, is that they relate to the expedition to the Isles in 1540 by James V. There's a reason for saying that. When James MacDonald was lifted by the king and taken back and imprisoned for a few years until the death of the said king. I think they're the most likely explanations of why they're there. And again, it's interesting because this is potentially archaeological evidence for fine detail that's not coming across from other sources. There's also a fair amount of evidence for lead shot. The problem with interpreting that is that it's mostly unstratified. But the other problem is that when you find lead shot, in a place where people were shooting guns and trying to kill birds, you can't necessarily say it's something to do with a particular event. Next one, please. And this is the final slide. You'd be glad to know that what we finally got dating to the 16th century is several buildings which are, sort of dry stone, sub-rectangular structures. The houses and barns and storage units of low-status people, just what other people would have called peasants in this part of the world. And, you might think, well, there we have it, Finlaggan, a great, wonderful place, and it ends up with these people living on it. But that, you'll be glad to know, is not, I think, a very valid way of looking at this. There's half of one of the structures we excavated. And one of the interesting things about it, seems to me, is that what we're seeing here is that it's just collapsed just gradually over time because the roof has fallen in. And that's why you get this effect of the walls just slumping like it's a curtain roundabout thing. And in the top entrance, this is just an x-ray of it, we found some nails, and the evidence for this which is the hasp for a padlock. So it looks like we've got a series of houses, the end of Finlaggan, perhaps in the 17th century, a series of houses where people just basically shut them and went away and didn't come back. And again, that's something that we don't have a date for it, which is sad. It'd be nice if we could do more work and get that. But it's an interesting site. And the idea that anyway, that this is marks the end of a long story, and going down the social scale. Not a good way of looking at this. What I think you're seeing, and the way you should look at this, is that this is the dawn of the modern world. That this is a new way. It's the end of a past which perhaps was better seen away with. And these are the people who are your ancestors. And that to me is one of the great importances of it and why you should be interested in it. So thank you very much.